Hi, everybody. Mike Bloom here, back with another Survivor 50 preseason podcast telling you what you need to know about the cast of Survivor 50. And today, we are talking about an Emmy winner, and ME is excited to be talking once again about Mike White playing on Survivor. Even before, he took home the gold, he was a fan of the show in multiple ways, and he truly dazzled on David versus Goliath. And now he gets another chance to do so as somebody who is perhaps part of a season where the credo was, you can't write this shit. He did and created the White Lotus. So incredibly excited to talk about what that might mean for Mike's second time on the island. But of course, we are bringing in a person who knows her way around a scripted show or two, much like Mike White proper, including some of Mike White's properties. It is the one, the only Grace Leeder.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike. Very excited to be chatting about Mike White today.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when it comes to the Survivor 50 cast being revealed, there were certainly some surprises one way or the other. Where did Mike White rate for you? Because I think, especially, again, we talk about his post Survivor career and especially something like the White Lotus, which is far and away his most successful property to date. People might have had a mind to be like, okay, he's clearly just moved on from the show, from reality TV in general. So were you surprised to find him back in the mix?
I think I was, and then when I started to go back and even watching some moments to prepare for this podcast, realizing oh, we kind of probably shouldn't have been surprised. This is a guy who I think, despite the success he has had post Survivor, he also had a ton of success pre going on Survivor, originally on The Amazing Race as well, and just seems to be in love with Survivor specifically, but reality TV in general. And so kind of does have that ability to just say okay, I'll just forego whatever else I'm doing, and I would happily go play Survivor. And so he did go play Survivor. And so I feel like it did feel like maybe he was too big for the show. And yet I think when you look at actually his time on the show, he was successful before he went on the first time. So it maybe shouldn't have been as much of a surprise that he would be willing to go back and play Survivor again.
Well, not to mention the fact that after the cast was revealed, of course, Jeff Probst goes on the air on CBS Mornings and says, after Mike White played Survivor for the first time, he told me, call me when there's an all-star season. And this was literally the first opportunity they could get to call Mike White for an all-star season. And for those that don't know, I mean, before Mike was a player, he was a fan. He, as you said, was on The Amazing Race twice. So he has certainly known his way around the reality TV circuits. But he was someone that would give Jeff Probst creative advice. The story that Jeff has told is that Survivor San Juan del Sur, much like the first Blood versus Water season, was going to have Redemption Island in it, where contestants are voted out and sent to a purgatorial place to compete for a spot back in the game. And Mike, over dinner with Jeff one time, basically said, don't do that. Nobody likes Redemption Island. And so through his power, he was able to not make this happen. Now, on the one hand, maybe you could look at that as oh, Jeff Probst's celebrity friend gets to go on Survivor 50, but my favorite player does it. But as we're going to kind of relitigate here, Grace, Mike earned his spot. I think in a cast that is full of absolutely dynamite characters and players, Mike is certainly among them.
Yeah, Mike is such an interesting case study of sort of and I feel like we get it a little bit less often than we used to in terms of the sort of celebrity casting. We've had very few athletes in the new era. Can only think of maybe in terms of NFL, played in the NFL type athletes. We have had some very successful athletes play, but sort of a celebrity who was sort of famous, and there often this thing that would happen when they would be on the season of whether or not people would recognize them or not. And Mike, I think, is arguably one of the strongest players out of all the people who you would say had notoriety before he went on the show. And I think I feel like people forget that a little bit, just how well he played. I think partially due to being a losing finalist, which is a little bit of I think a check against you in some ways, in terms of how well you played. If you get to the end and lose, some people could say you were robbed, but in other ways, it's
I would say one certain podcast has said that.
They do say Mike White was robbed. That's right. But as opposed to maybe going out fourth, fifth place. Like there's a little bit more of like, oh, what could have been, as opposed to maybe what happened with Mike. But looking back at his game, he played an excellent game. I think is one of the most intriguing people for me in terms of coming back and at least having longevity in a Survivor 50 game.
Well, let's get into the story of the storyteller himself, Grace. What is the tale of Mike White's 39-day journey through Survivor David versus Goliath?
Well, I think the story of Mike White and David versus Goliath is somebody who does have like a little bit of a, I guess not target, but he's a known presence, and yet sort of just, and he's in the world of Survivor, he's a little bit he's older.
Yeah.
He literally gets put on the Goliath tribe, right? Like he gets sort of like equal
That's what
billing
happens
with
when you
9
write
other.
Nacho Libre, Grace.
That's true. But I think that what I think is most impressive about Mike's White game, and it's the thing I think I really loved about watching him, is the way he is I think he's a little bit like sharper in confessionals in terms of like he just sees the world in a way that I find very relatable and endearing. Of like, look at the silliness that is going around, and he is on a season with like many larger than life characters. So much so that he ends up casting them as characters on the television show that he creates many times over. But there is this sense of like how to view the world and then how to navigate through that and develop bonds with people. Like it was sort of surprising in my memory of Mike White. It was a little bit that like him and Angelina were like, very close knit and they go to the end together. And yet in reality, he's often calling her a psychopath, like two other players and sort of like, kind of like, Jeff will call out that he's sort of like putting his hand over his face as she is saying something at tribal council. And so it is this ability to sort of like view the wildness of the things that are happening around him and be able to have that sense about him to like figure out where he sits in that and where to maneuver himself and develop these social bonds with people in the way that you try to connect with different people. And like the White Lotus is a very like ensemble heavy cast. I think he is good at looking at like what type of person is that and how can I connect with them, or how can I maneuver my way through this game with that type of person while also dealing with this type of person. So it's a very social game that ultimately doesn't end up winning the game, but gets him very far and earns him some votes. So
all right, let's get the resume of Mike White as he auditions for us on this podcast. Mike White, currently 55 years old, played on Dave vs. Goliath, where he indeed came in second place. I believe the final vote was like 7-3, I want to say, out of the 10 jurors. He played all 39 days. Won 5 challenges in the pre-merge, won 4 individual challenges in the post-merge, including an individual immunity win. Got only 1 vote against him at the final 5 from Miss B Plus herself, Allison. And I think that speaks to Mike's position in David versus Goliath, which is regarded as one of the best modern seasons because it is so topsy-turvy, so power shifty. And Mike is a large part of that, where he's in trouble from the beginning because he goes a little too fangirly in the very first day, goes out idol hunting, has a lot of sus around him. But then by the end of the pre-merge, like he is in the catbird's position as he basically has to decide between Angelina and Lyrsa as to who's voted out. He turns his entire tribe essentially onto Natalie. Then as the merge goes along, the Davids, as the Bible dictates, were able to take power through a number of advantages and, sudden shifts to leave Mike on the bottom. But then he suddenly finds himself back in the swing vote position when the Davids decide to turn on one another. And what's so interesting, Grace, is that even though Mike White has been on The Amazing Race and Survivor, he actually adopts kind of a similar strategy that Rob Cesternino always espouses for a show like Big Brother, which is like Mike laid, I think, from an active gameplay perspective, pretty dormant in the first half of David versus Goliath. He was certainly making moves, and again, he was in a powerful position, but he was never one to be like, all right, we're gunning for this person.
Yes.
That's what's happening. But I think that Mike, starting with, after he became the one to determine the essentially the hit on the Godfather in Carl, after that, Mike really turns on the NOS. He is the one to suggest like, hey, Christian might have an idol. Let's throw our votes onto Gabby instead, which successfully gets rid of her. Hey, now we can finally go after Christian. Someone he had been targeting for essentially the entire post-merge is finally able to make that happen. He's the one that turns the vote onto Davey at the final 6. And granted, after that, he ends up getting thrown into Final Four fire making, but he is able to prevail because of that. But I think he is able to put together a very solid end game. And honestly, I think on paper, play the game that is usually the most repetitively successful in Survivor, right? Especially from a new era perspective, which is like, hey, lay low in the early days, as long as it's not me, but like make sure you're in the know. And then when you've got your feet under you and you've got the relationships you need, you've got your final 2s and 3s locked in place, then start to make the moves, then start to put the moves on your name.
Well, I think what's really interesting about Mike's game is that basically, I mean, like, I think that they don't well, they go to tribal, like Pat gets medically evacuated, and then Jess goes to the Jeremy vote, who he actually was like, he really liked Jeremy. He bonded
because
really
Jeremy bossed him around.
That is it's so funny. Yeah, which I think actually does tell us something about Mike's eventual game, which is that he is willing to sort of go along, and in some ways, because I think he is a known person, he has to figure out how to manage his threat level to a degree in terms of like any reason to vote somebody out. I mean, I think like a really good example of somebody who has basically the opposite result of Mike White is actually John Lovett, who comes in as somebody who is somewhat well known and ends up going out first. I think because there in some ways is like any reason to get rid of somebody is a reason to get rid of somebody. Whereas Mike is able to make sure that that's not what is said about him. And specifically when they get swapped and he's in the minority and they vote out Natalie, but then he ends up ingratiating himself to the point where he does get to decide whether or not it's Lyrsa and Angelina who goes, and ultimately they vote out Lyrsa. Then once you get to the merge and you have the Goliaths being targeted, he also has to, there are these like bigger, more physical threats who end up being the target in terms of, I think back to back you get John, Dan, and Alec going out. You could see a world where like Mike is a name who's put out in terms of in somewhat of that order, but I think it shows just how well he's able to bond and ingratiate himself, that he is not the person who ends up going sort of in any of those spots, the Natalie spot or any of the sort of that first 3 of the Goliath merge bits.
Yeah, so I think definitely his biggest strength would probably be, again, his ability to kind of see the forest for the trees. I think Mike, from especially working in Hollywood so much from like a directorial creator perspective, he has an ability to kind of be everywhere at once and be able to assess really well what the situation is. Not to say he wasn't left out of some votes. He certainly was at the beginning of the merge with everything that the Davids were doing. But as you mentioned, he was never in trouble, right? He was part of like that weird aborted strike force cross tribal alliance that never ended up happening. I think, if we were to ask about any sort of weakness, I guess it would be, Grace, what has been discussed as like the reason he lost the game, which we did not necessarily see. But Mike White, again, is a storyteller. That's what he does. And it has been talked about from his castmates. It's been talked about from Mike himself. When I remember in his quarantine questionnaire with Dalton Ross, he was asked, like, what is like not the biggest regret, but like the biggest thing you would change about your game if you came back. And he admitted, like, he was sitting in the end. It was him, Angelina, another Goliath, and Nick, a David. Yeah. And he basically said, like, how horrible would it look for all of us if a Goliath won the money? Especially like given Nick's background, he came from living off of food stamps to becoming this public defender. How bad would all of us look, me especially, if you gave me the, Hollywood glitterati more money and the title of Sole Survivor? I know I said I wanted it more than I wanted an award, though I will get my award down the line. And a lot of people sort of credited that. He does end up still getting a few votes, but like, I think the jury has largely mentioned that Mike sort of abdicating his position in the final tribal council was a large reason why he lost.
Yeah, it's sort of tough in the way that I think that like sort of not that he lost the game and like in terms of like his ability to win $1 million on day one, but like, in some ways, maybe in terms of being potentially the most successful Goliath on the Goliath tribe in a season that's called David versus Goliath. Like, is there anybody, I don't know if you could put anybody else sort of even close to Mike White. John Hennigan has a lot of like success. That feels like super niche compared to the field that Mike White is in. So it's so tough. It ends up being a situation where Nick wins that final immunity challenge. And so Nick is sitting in the final 3, and as a result, and by that point, he's going to be the only then David in the final three. I do then, therefore, though, have maybe some more optimism about Mike White's chances in a season like Survivor 50, where I think that there still is a sort of hierarchy of perhaps like perceived like the sort of the impression that other players might have of another player about like why they might be out there or who is deserving to win or whether somebody needs to win the game. But I do think on a season, I think the even if the playing field is not exactly level, it feels more level than David versus Goliath.
That's my biggest concern, though, is that Mike White loves narrative. He loves the undercurrent of what makes a good story. And I think it could be even worse in Survivor 50, where arguably I think a lot of people are coming in with the narrative of we need this to be a good season, if not a great season. We know that returning seasons can be hit or miss, but like we were picked very specifically to be representing this historic cast for this historic season. And so, like, there is a part of me that wonders, like, I think Mike is coming back incredibly hungry. I think he still wants to win. And again, I think he doesn't necessarily regret kind of handing Nick the win, but I think he does probably feel a certain way about, like, I could have won if I really wanted to. But honestly, part of me wonders, Grace, especially now that he's become even more firmly entrenched in like, oh, I'm inspired by this, I'm inspired by that. Like, could there be a world where he's like, you know what? Wouldn't it be fun if Suri finally won the game? I think I want to sit in the final three with Suri.
Um, I mean, I guess so. An interesting thing about in terms of the White Lotus and the White Lotus being a show that is seems to be so inspired by Survivor.
It was, yeah. I don't think Mike has given this quote many times. I think he was like directly inspired specifically by I feel like a European vacation he was taking, but I think him being on Survivor, specifically the idea of like you are in paradise, but you are tearing at each other's throats. That dichotomy was something that he kept after the island to channel into the show.
And he's formatted episodes in a way where it's sort of like it's a day, and then it's like by the end of the day you're at dinner, which is sort of the equivalent of like kind of tribal council. There's obviously this element of a murder mystery in the White Lotus, which is not one-to-one to Survivor, but this idea of sort of somebody will be eliminated, somebody really loses in the White Lotus, I guess you could say, is really interesting to look at. The thing that we've also heard about the White Lotus is how like sort of neat, like tight the casts of those shows are, that they essentially go.
Well,
and
don't ask Walton Goggins and Amy Lou Wood about that.
Yes, but there does seem, which I think is also Survivor like, in terms of like not every in a big group like that, not everybody fits into that equation or fits into the dynamic. And so I think that Mike White's actually ability to navigate that and create 3 seasons of a highly successful HBO Sunday night drama is actually telling about what he could do in the game of Survivor. Again, I think certainly he could be drawn into the appeal of it all. I do think when I look at the makeup of the cast, like kind of Survivor 50, I feel like Mike actually fits really well in actually like 2 major buckets. I don't know whether you feel like this is accurate or not. I feel you've dived more deep into
I have not talked about buckets, so please bring out the hardware.
Well, the buckets for me there are these like incredibly like old school, loyal to the bone, sort of like, like you have your Colby, I think Stephanie, Coach fits into even Ozzy. I think that you have sort of these, Jonathan is somebody who I would put in this bucket of sort of like this old school, we're going to be really loyal, which I actually think if you look at Mike White's game actually does fit him pretty well. He is willing to, I think, like sort of like to some degree let people go if it like.
I mean, like when he's on the bottom, when the Goliaths are outnumbered, like him and Kara get taken on a reward, and he flat out is like, if we need to take out else, then I'm more than happy to do so.
I think he says use our votes or something like that, like use it. But there is a degree to which actually I think it's interesting to think about when we talk about him losing to Nick. Nick is also one of the reasons I think he probably doesn't end up being more of a target in the early, like he's not a Goliath target, because he develops the rock star alliance with him. Yeah, playing the air guitar. That like Nick is sort of enamored with Mike, and Mike, I think, like uses that to his advantage, and ultimately ends up being a little bit of his downfall because he sort of needs Nick to ride through sort of the Goliaths going out and then the flip back to some of the Davids in terms, and then the end game. So it's a little bit like a double-edged sword there. I also think that Mike is very strategic, and he
Yeah.
can like see the game very well, which I think fits into this other a group of people that I think you see on the cast, which is like your Aubreys or your Cerise, D, Camilla. Like I think Charlie, I think Jen. There's so many of those. I feel like if you look at sort of you split up these two buckets of people, and I'm generalizing a lot, is that you sort of have. I think he can be both loyal and strategic, and he can kind of like adapt to whichever one is more necessary at the moment, depending on the position he's in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike was really able to benefit from his sort of like unassuming persona. Like, he doesn't
Yes.
really act like a typical Hollywood type that you might think. He is, to your point, very self deprecating, very funny. And I think it's that classic example, almost in like a jam way, of like the court jester who's actually the person with the most power in the entire kingdom, because he's the one who everyone does not suspect, but he has kind of the keys and the information to everything that's happening. And so it allowed him to, again, build some really nice bonds with people just by sort of being himself and making people laugh and be comfortable. So that down the line, when he's like, yeah, but we do need to go after Christian. Yeah, but we could make this move tonight. He's able to really easily do so and kind of take control of the last like 4 or 5 episodes of that season.
I think also doing it in a way that doesn't come off threatening. I think that's a big.
Yeah.
I think the modern era of Survivor is filled with sort of like people continually feeling like they need to cut the head off the snake without realizing that they're now the head of the snake, and so they get rid of a big target, and then suddenly they're the next person in line. And I think Mike White has this ability to like cut the head off the snake, and people are still like, you're still the tail of the snake, like we don't, you're not now in charge. I think, which is I think a misread by some other players. I think obviously the biggest challenge of that, although I do love the David versus Goliath cast, and I think that there are many capable players in that cast. I would say that there is the step up in terms of the quality of players that Mike will be playing against in Survivor 50, obviously, because it's the combination of this many seasons of Survivor.
Let's talk about perception here, because listen, it has been a joke that has been bandied about the internet since people first found out that Mike would be playing. But like, how much do you think people will authentically believe like Mike's going to get everybody because all these players want a cameo on the White Lotus? You know, we talk about how unsuspecting Mike was able to be that first time around, but after his success in the game and perhaps his success off of the island, is he able to make this happen again?
I keep wanting to dismiss this theory as like so bogus. The fact that people would keep Mike White around because there is the idea that you might end up being on an HBO television show. And yet there's a little part of me that can't help but think it's not true. And I don't think I mean, I guess I could be like so deceived, and maybe this is like the charm that Mike White can pull off, which is I guess you could see the third episode of the show where he's like, yeah, I'll tell them that they can be on the White Lotus. Like, what do I care? Like, let me just keep me in the game. And I think that there is a way again in which like that feels maybe a little bit like, I don't know, using something outside of the game that is not fair, but it is what he has to his advantage. And yet I would be like so charmed by that. I think that would be so funny. So I keep thinking it probably could work on at least a couple of people. And it's not just that he has a show that was super successful. It is that he has literally done this. And again, to the loyalty piece of it, he's really only brought, I'm correct in saying this, right? He's only brought people back on the show to make cameos who were on David versus Goliath.
Yeah, so far.
Yeah, between Alec and then Angelina and Kara, Natalie, Carl, Christian shows up in the finale. So, I do think it could. I wouldn't rule it out that like people aren't sort of like working with Mike to a degree because they see the benefit of what that might mean for them post Survivor. I don't think it like wins him the game,
No.
or like anybody makes a choice like that like is not to their benefit because it's there, but I don't think it's nothing.
Well, and I think the more important thing is that people don't think it's nothing, right? Like it could be
Right.
nothing but whatever happens, like in a Survivor season, and you could argue even more so in a returning player season, there is like an infinite number of reasons to target somebody. And so I could see a world where like if somebody feels like Mike's got this army going on of people he's recruiting. The casting couch is open for Mike White to bring people into the folds with the promise of being on a future White Lotus season. Might not be doing that whatsoever. I don't think that's going to stop other people from suspecting that and possibly targeting him, as unfounded as that might be.
Yeah, I don't think that that's unfair. Again, I think any reason to get rid of to find any reason, I think is a reason to vote somebody off. And him having that type of influence and sway, and having actually, again, like I think that there's a lot of these things that are actually double-edged sword. The thing that can be really useful to you in a game of Survivor is also the thing that is perceived to be your biggest threat, which is that he is super loyal and he has done this thing for people. And so it might be a reason to get rid of him as well.
All right. Well, let's look back at our cast here. A bunch of new possible extras to show up in The White Lotus season 4 and beyond. Now, of course, we have to start with the fact, and maybe another reason why Mike might be targeted is the fact that he is walking in with a trio, a holy trinity of people from his season. I want to start with, I would imagine, is the much more fortified connection, which is Angelina. Now, you do talk about the fact that, like, Mike loved reacting to Angelina's shenanigans, both behind her back and to her face a couple of times. But they were thick as thieves, especially towards the end. Like, I think it's safe to say that Mike was Angelina's closest ally,
Mm-hmm.
probably throughout the post-merge. They end up sitting together in the final 3. You know, that Jabeni group that escapes the pre-merge makes it all the way to the end. And as you mentioned, Angelina gets brought back for not one, but multiple episodes of The White Lotus. So do you think when they arrive back in Fiji, they're going to pick up from where they left off?
This is so tough, I think, for both of them, because in some ways, I think the thing that was great about Angela, looking back at watching Mike's game again, was just how I feel like I even kind of forgot just how like outwardly inelegant Angelina could be at times, in terms of it's not just asking for the jacket, it's also the rice negotiations. There's plenty of time. There's even in the final tribal council, there's a hilarious moment where somebody asks Mike a question and then Angelina says, actually, sorry, can I just respond to a previous question first? And then she starts doing it and she goes, I do want Mike to be able to speak. And Mike says, oh, thank you. And it's so funny because I think she's the exact type of person that Mike White is sort of. She's a perfect representation of actually, I think, what he is interested in about the White Lotus, which is these people who sort of say what's on their mind all the time. They're a little bit inelegant, but they're like kind of, they're hilarious, interesting people. So I think it's going to be very hard for Mike to not be compelled to be connected with Angelina. It obviously depends on sort of how the beginning of the game breaks down. I do feel like Mike is the type of player that if he sees the writing on the wall that like it's either her or me, I think that he would let her go. I think he is loyal when it makes sense to him. The best thing about the fact that they are such a vocal pair is that there are actually a number of these like very prominent pairs. To the idea that is Mike and Angelina the most threatening pair?
That's a good point. Yeah, when you're
I would
looking
say
at
maybe
like
not.
you're looking at Kyle and Camilla, you're looking at, even if they don't necessarily know the exact details, Rizzo and Savannah. You can even look at like Emily and Dee, who were not hard and fast allies, but like Dee is one of the most dominant winners there, and Emily's there by association. So like certainly, while they are a trio from a seasonal perspective, they're one of many pairs. But let's talk about the third point of that triangle here in Christian, because it's a lot more complicated there. Mike was ardently targeting Christian pretty much from the jump. He is one of the people that puts forward this idea at the final 12 of like, okay, we've got to go for Christian. He is a major threat. And so they do go along with that. They try to vote him out there. He is able to get an idol used on him to nullify all the votes. Then we have everything going on with the final 11, but then the idol nullifier gets played and Hot Cup Dan goes home. Then finally, time and time again, at the final 7, Mike is able to make his plan come to fruition to get rid of Christian. Now, Christian does end up voting for Mike. He says, despite, I think, the things that Mike was saying in Tribal Council, I want to vote for who I thought was the best player, and that was Mike. Something that I'm sure Mike appreciated. I think the bigger question is, Grace, how deep-seated is the idea of Christian's possible revenge against Mike for the fact that he was the thorn in his side for the post-merge?
I think this is a little bit of like almost like I don't know if I'm gonna say the right terminology here, but like I think there's a little bit of like a double bluff thing that might happen here.
Mm,
Whereas I actually don't feel like Christian is going to worry about Mike to some degree. I think that Christian to me is so smart. He's so sensible that I don't think I think to I don't see Christian as a revenge motivated player, to be somebody
mm,
who will be so focused in on doing a particular, a course of action at the risk of his own game. I think if it benefits his game that Mike needs to go out, then that makes a lot of sense. If there's a situation where people are looking at the David versus Goliath trios and you're thinking about whether or not to vote out Christian or Mike, I don't see the Christian saying, let's figure something else out. I think he might happily say, okay, well, then Mike has to go. But I don't think Christian is going to be so targeted in on Mike. I do worry about Mike being worried that Christian will be targeted, like
mm.
focused in on Mike, and that being a reason for Mike to not really ever want to work with Christian. I think that like I could see Mike feeling like Christian is the biggest threat to sort of, I think even more than Angelina in terms of like a David versus Goliath um situation. Does that make sense? I feel
Yeah.
like that makes more sense to me than Christian being narrowly focused in on Mike.
Well, let's widen our focus. You talked about the buckets that Mike falls in, but any particular people you think would want to join Mike White's proverbial cast of an alliance?
Ooh, this is I do think there are a lot of people who I think will at the very least very much enjoy the Mike White experience in terms of him as a human being and just how funny he is. I can see, I mean, he does sort of, there is a situation I think at some point in the game where it's like him and a lot of the women, and I can sort of see I could see him connecting with Suri. I think
Mm,
Suri is a very like tell it like it is, and sort of delighting in being uh you know masterminding things that are happening against some other people. I think sort of Savannah D. I think
yeah.
could be. These are people who I think sort of have the type of personality who could really connect with and bond with Mike. Chrissy, even maybe to some degree. These are the people that I'm thinking Mike could have a good relationship with.
What about on the other side of things? Do you think there is anybody that for one reason or another might say that it's Mike's time to go? We cannot let him get to the end again.
I do worry the most about if he just doesn't jive with these people who are like sort of the most loyal, like sort of like
Mm,
play that style of game. I'm thinking about like Joe and Jonathan, but I think Mike has a way to charm them. But if you can't, and I don't mean this from like, it's not that it's not working from Mike's perspective. It's more that like they're just not open to, to receiving like a relationship with Mike, or something happens that sort of they feel like they're on the outs and they don't want to steer away from that. That's who I'm sort of most worried about for Mike White's game. I mean that, and then the people who most perceive him to be a threat to them potentially
mm,
winning the game. Yeah.
yeah. All right, Grace. One final question, and it's an important one. On that note, why will Mike White's story have a happy ending? Why will he win Survivor 50?
I think Mike proved that he can do it. I think his game in David versus Goliath is not only an excellent example of the way he could play the game and get to the end, and actually in many cases win. But I also think it's an incredibly repeatable
Yeah.
game. It is not a game that feels like he didn't rely on a lot of immunity wins or hidden immunity idols. It was an extremely social game where there was moments where he was on the outside, and what should have been a moment where people should have looked at Mike and voted him out, and he was able to figure out a way to reduce his threat and make sure somebody else was voted out instead of him in a way that feels like he could certainly do that again, especially considering the level to which there are threats on Survivor 50. So that's why I think Mike has, and the ability for him to craft a story. I think if
Yeah.
there's one lesson that he might have learned, which is I told the story, but I told a losing story. Well, let me figure out how to tell a winning story this time. I think that is something he could fix from his previous endeavor on
Listen,
Survivor.
he's built a career on making pitches to executives, and some of them don't get bought, and some of them are $1 million deals. And so he's
Yeah.
hoping to land the ladder here. Yeah, I do not the ladder that Angelina's climbing. Yeah, I think that as I mentioned before, the weird thing about Mike in sort of reinvestigating his game is that I really do think he plays a game that's very conducive to the new era. I think when
Right.
you look at a lot of these pre-40 players, you do have to wonder, like, okay, is what they did in a 39-day game not only applicable to a 26-day game, but also like in whatever's going to be thrown their way? Billie Eilish, Boomerang Idols,
I
Journeys,
forgot about all this stuff.
like, but the fact of the matter
That's
is, I
okay.
think Mike, no matter what, I think what is valued in that type of new era atmosphere is consistency, right? Is that ability to like maintain your position despite the number of variables that are being thrown your way. And Mike was able to do that. Again, even when he was on the outside of the majority, he was still in a relatively safe position to the point where he then became arguably the most powerful position in the middle of a couple of groups. So no matter how much we get of him, it is going to be such a good time. There's a reason, Grace, why he was the last person shown in that Survivor 50 trailer, because they know whatever he's going to give is gold. And I think Mike is going to give a lot, both to this game and to the confessionals this season.
Yeah, at the very least, whether or not Mike plays a game that I walk away, because I really do feel like, and it feels like I'm trying to get cast on the White Lotus, how much I'm talking up Mike White, but I really do love him as a Survivor player. I think he is a very good Survivor player. I really love the way he just uses humor to basically like break through and to be able to basically say what he wants without people feeling like it's as like serious probably as sometimes other people might say something. So he is, I think, a really great player. And then I just think I'm so excited to see him on television. He has
Yeah.
two of my favorite moments of the last how many years of Survivor, which is the drinking wine while they're looking for
Good luck.
the advantage. It's so funny. The like I use that gif of like him like rolling his eyes while he's drinking the wine. And then I also think like, and it's like I think it's very impressive like to make Jeff Probst like really like sort of brings a different energy, which is when he says, well, we have nothing for you. And like that back and forthness. I'm very much looking forward to having Mike White back on my television screen.
Well, I know, Grace, that you would never have nothing for us. You are always podcasting out there. So thank you for taking some time to stop in and talk all things Mike White. But of course, you are remiss to talk about a lot of scripted TV and movies out there. So what would you like to plug for the listeners?
Yeah, Taryn and I would do the Tastemakers. So, and basically the premise of that podcast is like, let us help you find what is good to watch on television. And so we recently, depending on when this comes out, there'll be on the YouTube feed or in the podcast feed, you can listen to the top 10 TV shows and top 10 movies of the year voted on by myself, Taryn, and the audience. So, yeah, writing for Parade alongside you, Mike, writing on Popeyes. So I'm on social media at Hi From Grace, doing all sorts of things related to television.
All right. Well, we will continue on that Survivor beat coming up next as we go from like an old schooler to like a capital O old schooler in Ozzy Luth. We'll be talking about Ozzy's previous 4 seasons on Survivor and the reputation he has sought from that, and whether it'll be, a rerun, I guess to use a television term, for his 5th time out, or perhaps a brand new episode. But let us know your thoughts. What do you think about Mike White coming back, especially with the glory he has gotten both on and off the island? How do you think he's going to work with Angelina and Christian, if at all? Let us know what you think. But Mike is one of the many reasons why I am so excited for the premiere of Survivor 50 coming up on February 25th. Thank you all, as always, so much for listening. Grace, thank you for the great work. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.
This is RHAP. We know reality TV.